Detroit Become Human is essentially a playable sci-fi thriller where breathing at the wrong moment feels like it could kill off a main character. The branching narrative here is genuinely absurd. Make one weird choice during a hostage negotiation early on, and an entire chunk of the endgame fundamentally changes. Quantic Dream built a flowchart of consequences so dense that you'll need 3 playthroughs just to see half the script. Seeing a cinematic experience of this budget drop below $4 is just silly. That's less than a bad cup of coffee for a branching narrative that will completely hijack your weekend. Mass Effect Legendary Edition packages an entire space opera trilogy into a single launcher, modernizing a story that defined a generation of RPGs. Carrying the exact same character and all their messy diplomatic mistakes across 3 massive titles is a mechanic nobody has really matched since. Sure, the Mako vehicle sections in the first game still handle like a shopping cart on ice, but the payoff of watching your crew's loyalties evolve over 100+ hours makes up for the jank. Picking up 3 of the most acclaimed sci-fi epics in gaming history for less than $5 feels like a glitch in the storefront. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order takes the punishing rhythm of a Souls-like and coats it in lightsaber burns. Nailing a perfect parry against an Inquisitor before force-pushing a squad of stormtroopers off a ledge captures a specific cinematic fantasy perfectly. The map design can occasionally feel like a confusing maze of backtracking, but the sheer visceral weight of the melee combat carries the experience. When you realize Respawn Entertainment's single-player epic is sitting at essentially $4, hesitating barely makes sense. It perfectly scratches that itch for a demanding, heavy-hitting action game where every combat encounter feels dangerous. Devil May Cry 5 aggressively demands that you look as cool as physically possible. Scraping by with a victory means nothing if you didn't do it while taunting a boss in mid-air. The combat engine is terrifyingly deep, allowing players to juggle enemies for actual minutes without touching the ground once the muscle memory clicks. Getting access to an action engine this finely tuned for around $4.50 is an absolute no-brainer. Fighting through hordes of demons to a dynamic heavy metal soundtrack that gets louder the better you play never gets old. Disco Elysium The Final Cut completely discards combat in favor of arguing with your own shattered psyche. Waking up with a hangover so violent it induces amnesia, players stumble through a surreal murder investigation where failing a dice roll often leads to infinitely more entertaining situations than succeeding. Your necktie might suddenly be giving you terrible life advice, or you might genuinely die from trying to grab a ceiling fan. Grabbing a narrative masterpiece with this much reactive writing for $4 is wild. It will make you laugh out loud and question your political compass in the exact same hour. Dead by Daylight runs on pure adrenaline and paranoia. The asymmetric loop of 4 desperate survivors trying to outsmart one superpowered killer generates an endless supply of unscripted horror movie moments. One match, you're flawlessly looping a killer around a shack, and the next, you're accidentally leading Michael Myers directly into your terrified friends. The initial learning curve can definitely feel a bit punishing against veteran killers, but the chaotic fun with friends is unmatched. Paying $8 for a multiplayer ecosystem that regularly mashes up every major horror franchise in existence gives you ridiculous long-term cooperative value. Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade somehow manages to rebuild a nostalgia powerhouse without ruining the memories. The combat system effortlessly blends real-time action with tactical menu commands, forcing aggressive strategy during boss fights that can easily push 15 minutes of pure spectacle. Midgar feels incredibly dense, even if some of the side quests drag the pacing down a little. But seeing Square Enix's massive visual overhaul drop to $14 is the exact excuse to pull the trigger. Pushing through those final chapters and watching the timeline completely derail is an experience that begs to be played. Horizon Forbidden West demands precision under extreme pressure. Tearing specific armor plating off a metallic T-Rex while dodging laser fire requires a frantic, satisfying type of tactical archery. The sheer scale of the environments can definitely induce a bit of open-world fatigue if you try to clear every single map marker, but the core loop of hunting larger and more aggressive machines is flawless. At half price, dumping 50 hours into a sandbox where you're constantly upgrading gear by dismantling robotic megafauna piece by piece feels like an incredibly smart investment for anyone craving a massive blockbuster. Borderlands 4 doubles down on the sheer mathematical chaos of its loot system. The guns here generate with such wild combinations that finding a shotgun that shoots homing, brain-sucking lasers feels completely normal by hour 10. While the writing might lean a bit heavily on frantic internet humor, the actual shooting mechanics and build variety have never felt punchier. Snagging a major high-octane co-op shooter at a 50% discount while the player base is absolutely packed is just good timing. Sinking dozens of hours into finding the perfect absurd weapon combination with 3 friends remains an unbeatable weekend killer. The Last of Us Part 1 treats every single bullet like a luxury item, scavenging through a ruined, terrifyingly silent museum knowing you only have 3 revolver rounds and a half-broken brick ratchets up the tension to an agonizing levels. The PC port had a notoriously rough launch, but after extensive patching, the raw emotional weight of this survival horror masterpiece shines through. Securing this kind of prestige cinematic storytelling for $30 makes complete sense. Sneaking past a horde of infected when you're completely out of resources delivers a very specific type of suffocating relief. Crusader Kings III is less of a grand strategy title and more of a medieval soap opera generator. Forget mapping the map. The real strategy is figuring out how to inherit France by marrying off your eccentric cousin to a duke who accidentally falls off a balcony. The interface is undeniably intimidating at first, but once the chaotic logic clicks, the stories are incredible. Seeing this feudal drama engine marked down to $15 is dangerously cheap for a title that routinely eats entire weekends. You'll log off realizing you just spent 4 hours orchestrating a revenge plot over a stolen artifact. XCOM 2 thrives on absolute tactical misery and triumphant comebacks. Commanding a guerrilla resistance force means constantly operating at a disadvantage, where one missed sniper shot can lead to the permanent death of a soldier you spent 20 hours customizing. The sheer panic of a simple extraction mission spiraling out of control is a feeling Firaxis perfected. Yes, missing a 95% hit chance is infuriating, but it makes the flawless operations feel earned. Dropping $3 on a strategy title with limitless replayability and a massive modding scene is honestly one of the highest value propositions on the entire platform. NBA 2K26 translates the momentum of professional basketball into a terrifyingly realistic simulation. Getting the timing down on a heavily contested jump shot or threading a bounce pass through traffic requires actual rhythm and court awareness. It's no secret that the microtransaction menus can feel aggressive if you're trying to max out a career player quickly. However, finding the latest entry in this massive sports franchise sitting under $10 completely changes the math. Grabbing friends for a few casual games in franchise mode delivers endless competitive trash talk without breaking the bank. Euro Truck Simulator 2 sounds incredibly boring on paper until you actually sit in the digital cab, delivering frozen goods from Berlin to Prague while listening to a real-world German radio station is weirdly hypnotic. The physics demand respect, especially when trying to reverse a double trailer in a tight depot during a thunderstorm. For $5, this isn't just a driving game, it's an interactive meditation app. The community around this title has spent thousands of hours hauling cargo simply because the rhythm of the open road is the perfect way to decompress after a terrible workday. Risk of Rain 2 is an exercise in pushing a game's engine to its absolute breaking point. The roguelike scaling dictates that the longer you survive, the harder the enemies hit, forcing you to sprint through stages collecting ridiculous stacks of items. By minute 40, you're not really playing a shooter anymore. You're operating a walking natural disaster fueled by 50 rusty knives and a dozen energy drinks. Catching this much cooperative insanity for a little over $8 is a massive steal. Trying to decipher the screen during a late-game boss fight is a beautiful, chaotic nightmare. Sons of Forest merges peaceful cabin construction with unrelenting psychological terror. Spending 2 hours building a beautiful lakeside retreat is instantly ruined when you hear the screech of a mutated cannibal sprinting through the brush. The AI of the hostile islanders is deeply unsettling, as they'll often just stand in the tree line watching you before deciding to attack. The physics-based building system occasionally gets a little fussy, but the survival mechanics are incredibly engaging. Scoring this tense cooperative nightmare for under $10 guarantees a weekend of pure, panicked yelling with your friends in the dark.
Ark Survival Ascended taps directly into the primal fantasy of riding a heavily armed dinosaur into battle. Surviving the first few hours means hiding from everything that moves, but eventually you're breeding an army of genetic super raptors to raid enemy bases. The engine overhaul makes the harsh environments look phenomenal, even if the optimization still struggles on mid-range hardware. For about $11, the sheer volume of content is staggering. You aren't just buying a survival game, you're buying a second job where you will eventually set an alarm for 3 in the morning to feed a baby T-Rex. Hearts of Iron 4 requires you to manage the entire logistical nightmare of a global conflict. Winning a war here isn't just about moving tanks, it's about making sure your factories have enough rubber to produce the tires for those tanks before the winter hits. The learning curve is notoriously steep and requires genuine patience to crack open, but seeing Paradox's flagship World War II simulator drop down to $10 is the perfect excuse to experience the madness. Successfully pulling off a massive encirclement maneuver after 3 hours of meticulous planning is a dopamine rush strategy fans crave. Monster Hunter Wilds makes every single boss fight feel like an exhausting, spectacular marathon. Tracking a massive beast across a dynamic ecosystem before engaging in a 30-minute brawl of traps, counters, and desperate dodges is incredibly satisfying. The clunky inventory management of older titles is mostly smoothed out, letting you focus on mastering the absurdly deep weapon combinations. Seeing a massive current-gen hunting experience drop below $30 is surprisingly tempting. Landing a perfectly timed final blow with a hammer the size of a minivan gives a feeling of triumph that very few action titles can replicate.
Mount and Blade 2 Bannerlord drops you onto a medieval battlefield with zero safety nets. You go from swinging a rusty sword at looters to commanding a massive army of cavalry, actively directing formations while fighting on the front lines. The political simulation side can sometimes feel a bit hollow, but the raw scale of the sieges is completely unmatched. Grabbing this hybrid sandbox for $20 is an insanely good value. Watching 100 heavy cavalry crest a hill and absolutely shatter an enemy flank right when you needed it is a cinematic rush created entirely by the simulation. Total War Warhammer 3 lets you orchestrate the kind of epic fantasy clashes usually reserved for multi-million-dollar movie budgets. Zooming in to watch a giant charging scatter a front line of terrified halberdiers never loses its charm. The Grand Campaign map is incredibly demanding, requiring tight economic management alongside the real-time bloodbaths. At under $9, acquiring an incredibly dense strategy sandbox packed with wildly different asymmetrical factions is a ridiculously smart play. You could easily lose 80 hours just learning the mechanics of a single demonic faction before even touching the rest of the roster. Far Cry 6 embraces the absolute absurdity of guerrilla warfare. Strapping a jury-rigged rocket launcher to your back and sending an attack crocodile into an enemy checkpoint delivers a very specific brand of explosive sandbox chaos. Yes, the open-world formula here is undeniably familiar, relying on the same outpost clearing loop the franchise is known for, but nabbing this massive tropical playground for $15 completely recontextualizes the value. When you just want to shut your brain off, grab a friend and co-op, and blow up a heavily guarded military base with a CD-launching crossbow, this absolutely delivers. MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries makes you feel the punishing weight of piloting a walking tank. Managing your heat sinks while trying to surgically blow off the weapons of an enemy chassis requires methodical, heavy-hitting precision. The mercenary management layer, where fixing a blown-off arm forces you to take on risky contracts just to make payroll, adds brutal stakes to every mission. Seeing this dense, stompy simulator available for under $8 is fantastic. Tearing through a destructible city in a 90-ton machine of war while desperately trying to keep your lance alive is an incredible power fantasy that punishes sloppy execution.